So I wanted to take a minute and talk a little bit about this funny title that I have, right? Chief Experience Officer. I'm pretty proud to say that the Barnes Foundation is the only museum in the United States and in Europe. There's only one other Chief Experience Officer that I know of, and that's in Australia. And the reason why I think that this title is so important is because it represents an idea. That what we're trying to do is we're trying to solve through the lens of every visitor. What we want to do is sort of, I think if you think about how we move through life in an organization, we get very embedded in our own stories. And as a Chief Experience Officer, what I'm constantly doing is trying to remove myself from the day-to-day and walk the floor and try and understand what's going on from someone else's point of view. And that's pretty cool. So the first thing that I had to do when I came here was try and understand who the audiences are at the Barnes, right? And we had done some data gathering, and I think when you see this picture, you're gonna recognize something that needs to potentially change a little bit. These are our current audiences, right? And I looked at this, and my director, Tom Collins, had a mandate in his strategic plan that said he wanted our audiences to be reflective of the city of Philadelphia. That we moved from Marion to the Parkway, and we exponentially increased the size of our audience, but we retained the same audience coming in, and actually we needed to think more broadly about audiences. And this is what Philadelphia looks like. So we have a long way to go to get there to make sure that we are aligned with our city. So we commissioned Be Heard Philly to do a survey of audiences who were not coming here, right? Very, very rarely do we listen to people who are not coming. And we started asking questions to try and understand what their primary motivation would be to come. And what we found is that their primary drivers were very different from our core audience. They were looking at exhibitions and programs as a way to come in the door, and they were also thinking about social visits as a way to come in the door. So we were looking at that, and we started to think, okay, we have two audience types, right? We have this core audience type, and we have a newcomer audience type. And a lot of institutions will tell you that they have these types, but I argue that our types are very far on the ends of this scale, right? And you actually have to think about them as two distinctly separate audiences moving forward. And you're going to hear me talk about core and newcomers a lot as I go through this presentation. So what you're seeing here is this institution that's here at a time of transition. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to think about iteration, we want to think about pilots. How can we test? How can we change things up just a little bit to see if we can create some change? And we've got a couple of points of entry. This makes sense, right? You've got sort of what happens off-site, what happens on the website. Don't worry, our website is changing. If you've looked at it lately, it's coming. But here's what happens when you come on-site. How many of you got lost when you came to the Barnes? Show of hands. Thank you. I'll tell you there's a very big signage and wayfinding project that is underway to try and help us through that project. But there are also small, easy things that we can do to create some change, right, that's more responsive to visitor behavior. So for instance, I lovingly call this our moat. It is a beautiful, beautiful moat, but it is a moat nonetheless. And you do have to cross the moat in order to get into the building. And our door is hidden behind the moat, which you may have found. And when I got here, a lot of people were saying to me, well, people will cross the moat, but here's what happens. Because they don't see the door, they see this. And because they see people behind this, they think that's the door, and they walk right through the moat. And then the solve for this was this, right? And you look at that and you think, well, that's not the most welcoming thing you could do. So what if we put a bench there? And there was all this talk at the Barnes, because we're the Barnes, right, about the bench being outside, and it has to be a nice bench and a beautiful bench, and it's not weatherproof, and we went through all of this. But I said, let's just put the bench outside and see if it works. Turns out it does. These people think I'm insane for taking these photos, but this is exactly what happens. People go to the door very naturally now. And this looks beautiful from both the inside and the outside. And you can think about this area programmatically too. For instance, now we have a horse out there greeting people because we have the Mohammed Barisa show, but it's functioning in that same sort of capacity. So then you come into the barns. If you had come into the barns a year ago, this is what you would have been faced with. This is probably the least welcoming thing that you could have seen. And it didn't matter how welcoming our staff were, they're still behind this gargantuan boat-like desk. And as you would go through your entry experience, we started to wonder, could we change things like this? What happens if we switch to a mobile ticketing system so that our staff can be positioned differently, and we put a lounge as the first thing that you see? And we have staff stand up rather than be behind this desk because we've now outfitted them with mobile tech. And we hire a staff that is as diverse as the city itself, right? So what we want to do is be as inclusive as possible, and we want that front lines to really be empowered to welcome visitors, but also think about things like the bench. This team is empowered to look at change that needs to be made on the floor and bring it to us so that we can look at that and say, okay, well, maybe we could try this, or maybe we could try that. They take their jobs very seriously, and I hope that the next time you're here at the Barns, you're greeted in a way that makes you feel very comfortable, because I know they're working very, very hard at making that happen. I'm very proud of them. So the other thing that we're trying to do is solve for the visitor behavior that we'd like to see. So there's the visitor behavior we see, which is walking through the moat and how you fix that. But then there's also this other thing, right, which is, well, sometimes we want a certain behavior. How do we get to that? So here's a really good example. This is our Young Professionals Night. I came in and everybody said, this is the most successful event we have. Don't break it. And I was like, okay. I said, well, what are the challenges with this event? And they said, well, it's this amazing party and everybody loves it, and we get this amazing audience, and it sells out every time, but nobody goes in the collection. And we'd really like them to go in the collection. I was like, well, why don't they go in the collection? And everybody kind of looked at me and they said, well, we're not sure. We think we might need to program inside the collection just like we program out here, right? And that makes sense, right? There's a DJ here, everybody's here, they're not in the collection. Maybe we need to do something in the collection like scavenger hunts or something. So we started looking at this equation, and I started at the first YP event, and I'm looking around, and I look at the collection door, and it looks like this, right? And when you look closer, this is what you see. You see a gigantic sign telling you everything you can't do in the middle of the walkway, right? It's the thing in your view shed that's basically saying don't come in. If you had any doubt, there's a guy next to it, and I love our security staff, but there's a guy next to it who looks like he's about to kill me because I pulled out my camera and I'm not even over the threshold. So we started to say, okay, look, let's just change this up a little bit. Let's light this a little differently. Let's move that sign a bit further in. Let's open up this view shed a little bit. Let's make it a little bit more like this. And here's how that needle starts to move. All of a sudden, if 30% of the people were going into the collection in June of 2016, a year later, over 3 events, we're at 69%. Huge. We didn't program the collection. We just looked at what that entrance looked like through the eyes of our visitors. So it's not only small things that take cues from visitors, it's also big projects as well. When I came to the Barns, Tom Collins, our director, took me through the galleries, and I was tired by gallery 2. How many of you have been in there? Yeah. How many of you would say that it's amazing but overwhelming? Yeah, okay. So Tom is taking me through the galleries, and he's like, there are so many stories to tell people, and here are all these ways we want people to see the collection, and I'm like, dude, I can't even get through gallery 2, and everything starts looking the same, and it feels very dense, and I get that there's all these stories, but I'm like gonna be tired by the time you start telling me these stories. So he hired me anyway, right? and we started looking at this equation when I came in, and what we started to see was that people were very social in the space. There's something about the way the space is hung that people have a natural want to talk, and you hear that in there. The other thing that we started to see is that the technology that we had given people, which is the audio tour, actually was inhibiting people from being conversational. The reason why we would see this is because you would start to see things like this happen. I call this the one ear off, because this guy's got the one ear off on that audio tour because he's trying to talk to the guy next to him. And then by about room 3, you start seeing this behavior all off. And as we started to look at this equation, I started to say, okay, well, it can't just all be about observation, right? Observation's the first step, so let's do some timing and tracking, try and figure out what's going on in there. And basically what we found is that the metrics started to prove insight, right? We started to see that if people were taking the audio tour, they were in there for an average of 88 minutes. And if they weren't taking it, they were in for a lot longer. And I work in the web where we work in terms of minutes, right, or seconds, and like to see this kind of spread is pretty significant. So I started going around and I started saying, okay, I think we need a different solution. And the touring solutions on the market are all about more, right? If you think about it, it's your audio tour, it's now a multimedia tour, it's now going to give you more content, different types of content, all these paths that Tom wanted. You know, there's a way to do this, but in our space, it might not necessarily be the right fit. So we started to look at this, and I started to say, okay, well, what if less is more, right? What if we look at something like a wearable? And what if we don't have audio content, but we have text content on the wearable that gets you looking? And what if we do something like, let's put different content on your wearable than my wearable so that when we're going through there, we're getting different stuff and we start to talk about it. I will tell you, trying to pitch this thing internally was a bit of a mess. You know, my favorite is the curator turned to me and said, how do you write a one-sentence story about the joy of life, right? We were thinking about that New York Times app, and we were thinking, oh, it should be one-sentence stories driven by location as you're walking through. And you know, Martha Lucy was like, what has my art history degree become? Are you kidding me? So it was at this point that we had gone to Barra and we said, hey, we've got a little bit of a crazy idea. And sometimes you can test things using pen and paper, right? I never like to throw digital at a test. I always like to test in analog first. But in this scenario, what we had seen is that we really needed something to hand people, and that this was especially true because if you think about those core audiences who are less familiar with tech, we started to wonder, is this going to work for them? And we really need a prototype. We really need to think about this project, and it's a bit of a risk. It's a risk to us in how we're thinking about things internally and how we process information, and it's a risk for our audiences. So how do we do this? And Barra awarded us as part of the Catalyst Fund so that we could build a prototype. And we built a prototype, and we tested the heck out of this thing. It took us less than 6 months to build it. We built it really fast. The point was to get it on the floor as fast as possible. And we tested with so many visitors that we have a ±5 validity rate, which is pretty significant. I mean, we really feel strongly about the data that we got. And here's what happened. This worked very well. Nothing like convincing internal stakeholders when you have something in your hand and you have some data around it. So here's how it worked. People would walk through like this, and just like this, a high percentage were reporting that they were looking at art more closely. This is critical. In anything you do in an art museum, you want to get them looking at art, not looking at the tech. The biggest thing that I would hear about this, inevitably, and I'm sure I'll do a show of hands, I bet a bunch of you thought, but I can't read on that small screen. Show of hands? That's okay, so that's 20%. It actually, people can read it. 94% said the text was very clear. This was huge, especially when you're testing with an audience that is of a certain generation, right? And we were testing with that audience, which was pretty great. And this is what would happen when we put different content on your device and different content on your device. This is what we would see, people talking. And 84% were saying that they were talking about the content. And that was just a very small tweak in this prototype to make this conversational. So that was pretty cool. Here's the big wow, right? 88 minutes with the audio tour, 106 minutes without the audio tour, 119 with the wearable. Now, what we would see with the wearable is we got to this 119 point, and once we started adding more and more content to it, because everybody would tell us we want more and more, we would see that 119 go down really dramatically and really fast. So there's this balance that has to be had among the amount of content you put on this screen and what people are asking for, but their behavior coming off of it is actually telling us that it's working pretty well. So one of the things about the Catalyst Fund that I so love is this idea that we're allowed to talk openly and honestly about our process, and that our funder is so great about letting that process happen and wanting you to share that knowledge. This included, we did a ton of blog posts about this project, including all of our data. We open sourced all of the code. And when I show you the slide that says this worked very well, the reality is there were lots of bumps along the road, like using zip ties and a hot glue gun to try and create a distribution system for this thing. And that was after we went to all the craft stores in the neighborhood to find something that held spools of thread, because distribution systems for these things don't exist yet. So we were sort of hacking this thing together, and we talk a lot about this. We talk a lot about battery life of the devices and all these things that we were facing. And I feel like having the opportunity to do that and do so bluntly is such a fantastic opportunity for our field. You can go and read all of these today, and it's pretty awesome. As we move from prototype to production, right? One of the things that we realized about writing short-form content is we have the ability now to write for two audiences. So if you think back to The Joy of Life, and you think about that core audience and that newcomer audience, that core audience is somebody who has been here multiple times and knows a lot about our collection, needs a different sentence. And it doesn't mean that that has to necessarily be longer. It just means that the content has to be customized for audience types. The nice thing about writing content like this is, for the first time ever in my career, we have the ability to do that. Audio content in museums takes so long to write and produce and edit and film, and yet I can write a sentence very quickly. So what we can do now is we have the ability to write many, many sentences and go back to Tom's original vision of the many stories that can be told inside the collection. And maybe what should happen is every time you come to the Barnes, this fixed collection that never changes constantly changes here. So maybe one day we have a tour on nudes, and the next day we have a tour on Picasso, and the next day you come in, it's something different. We have the ability to do that because in short form content, we have the ability to write that. So I've talked a lot about these two audiences, right, and getting ready for these audiences, and I think it's important to just sort of end this presentation on how we're thinking about audience development, right, because I haven't really talked about that too much. And one of the things that we're doing is we're looking at audience development from the same iterative process in the same pilot testing, and we're looking for partners who fill our gaps, right, and help us tell our story to a different set of people. When I first arrived, I'm a cyclist. When I first arrived in Philadelphia, I noticed something very different about the bike share here. The bike share here really thought about equity as a mandate for their entire program. And as a result, this is what their audience looks like. And because they release their data, I can look at a picture like this and say, is it really true? Is it really true that everybody that I see riding on bikes, they don't look like city bikers in New York? And because they release their data, what I could see is that their data was very reflective of the city. If you think back to that slide with the city figures, they are so in line with the city of Philadelphia that it made sense to partner with them in a very conclusive way to try and bring new audiences to the Barnes. And we came up with this program, Indigo. When I was talking to Indigo, they said, hey, listen, we really want audience to be involved in this. It's not an advertising campaign. This needs to be something of value for our writers. And I said, okay, well, what if we did this? What if we take Barnes paintings and we give everybody the opportunity to vote, and we wrap bikes in Barnes paintings that will be on the street for a year or more, and we put a discount on the street as well, so that if you're an Indigo Pass holder, you can come into the Barnes for free for an entire year. And the cool thing about that, right, is I think when we think about partnerships, we haggle a lot. I know we do this a lot at the Barnes, where we kind of go, all right, well, $5 off, $10 off. But what we want to see here over the course of a year is, does it really work, right? And what we want to do at the end of that year is be able to measure that, and we want to see not only did it work, but did it fail? And if you say it's free, then you know definitively, one way or another, that it worked or it didn't. And that was the primary purpose of creating a discount like that and doing a program like this that is very inclusive of audiences, because we really want to see if partnerships like this have the potential for us to welcome new audiences at the Barnes. Thank you.